I think we should begin now. I realize this is an unusual time, but this is actually the traditional time of the QUBS seminars. Typically we have them in person, but of course for the last year and now continuing into this year, we're having virtual seminars. So this is going to be our inaugural seminar with Lesley Rudy and Britt giving their exit seminars for their master's theses. Each of them will talk for about 25 minutes. So we'll have time for questions. And we're going to have seminars bi-weekly as part of this regular seminar series. So not every week, but every other week. And we have a couple of speakers planned that I think you will find will be quite interesting, including one we're planning to come in from Australia. Well, to communicate from Australia. Before I introduce Lesley, who will be our first speaker, I would like to begin by acknowledging that these traditional territories that we are on, or at least most of us, I realize some people are zooming in from elsewhere. These territories of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee have a much deeper history, one predating the establishment of the earliest European settlements. So this territory has significance for the indigenous peoples who lived and continue to live here, and whose practices and spiritualities were and are tied to this land. So Lesley, as I said, is going to be our first speaker. And tonight is going to be a very herpy night, because we're going to begin with a talk on turtles. And then the second talk will be on one of my favorite species of frog, the spring peeper. So Lesley did, I'm just pulling up a little note that she sent me here. Lesley did her undergraduate at University of Guelph in biology. Another Guelph alumnus or alumna did a certificate at Fleming College, and for the last decade has really been dedicated to stewardship, conservation, and also has been deeply involved in community granting. She is passionately interested in turtle biology and turtle conservation, and has been part of a citizen group that has really focused on Doug Fleur Park. She and a number of other community members who really work to better understand the biology of map turtles, painted turtles, and other species of turtles that occur there, but also to protect them during nesting season. And so she's going to talk a little bit about some of the work that she's been doing over the last 2 years as part of her master's degree. So take it away, Lesley.
So thank you everybody for coming. I see lots of familiar faces, or at least names written on the Zoom there. So thank you everybody for coming out. So I'm going to talk to you about hatchling northern map turtles today. So the first thing I want to cover as part of the background is the fact that turtles are very threatened. This is true both globally and locally. All 8 of the species of turtle in Ontario are considered at risk. That's at risk of extinction, and are listed by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, federally, as well as on the species at risk list in Ontario. And these are all human-caused threats. All the reasons for their being at risk are because of humans, mainly through habitat destruction, road mortality, boat mortality, pollution, climate change, the list goes on. And these, of course, these risks are higher in human-dominated landscapes because of the higher road density and higher rate of development. Part of the reason that turtles are particularly at risk of extinction is because of their life history. So there's a few things that makes them vulnerable. One is that they have long generation times, and that means that it takes a long time for a turtle to reach sexual maturity. And so they're not reproducing until after a number of years, which contributes to a slow replacement rate. They also have a very high mortality of their young, although they may, a female may lay many eggs over her lifetime. A very small percentage of those will actually make it to maturity. It's certainly less than 1%, and one study on snapping turtles estimated it to be 0.001%, so a very small amount, which also contributes to the slow replacement. Another reason their life history puts them at risk is because adult females exit the water to come on land to nest, and that puts them at risk of conflict with roads especially. And even losing a moderate amount of adult females because of the long maturation time can really put a population or species at risk of extinction. Also, the turtles have a long life, depending a bit on the species, how long they live, but decades. And because of this, the persistence of a few adults in the population can make it look like the population is healthy. So there may be a bunch of older adults out and basking, and it looks like there's lots of turtles around, but in reality, a population might have a very low or no recruitment. And once those adults do finally pass away, there won't be any new ones to replace them. So why it matters that turtles are at risk? Well, there's several reasons. First is because of their contribution to biodiversity. Of course, all species contribute to having a variety of life, and having biodiversity makes our ecosystems more resilient and provides more ecosystem services, which is something that we definitely want to maintain. Turtles specifically play important roles in aquatic ecosystems. They're often scavengers, cleaning up the water, or they're top predators, keeping populations of other things under control. And because they travel between the land and the water, they can transfer energy between those systems, whether it's through what they eat and poop or through their eggs that they deposit on land. I think it's also important to note two other things. One being that turtles have significant cultural value. Several indigenous cultures, turtles play a central role in creation myths, such as the concept of Turtle Island in North America. And I would also argue that every species has intrinsic value and has the right to exist. So my study species is the northern map turtle. I did also start out attempting to include painted turtles in the study, but didn't end up having enough data on them to draw any conclusions. Map turtles are listed as special concern, which is a lower level on the species at risk list, but as mentioned, they are on the species at risk list. Unlike some other turtles that prefer wetlands, they prefer more open, large bodies of water like lakes and big rivers. They eat snails and other mollusks. And one interesting thing about them, as shown in this picture provided by Dr. Bolte, is their sexual dimorphism, meaning that the male and female, their bodies are quite different. And in this species, it's in their size mainly. The female, as you can see, can be almost twice as big as the male. And partly due to that, and that the females lay eggs, it takes the females about 10 years, depending a little bit on the population, to mature, and the males about 4. So this is, again, this contributes to that long generation time I referred to before. So this is the range of the northern map turtle in the red. You can see that it's mostly northeastern North America, and we here in Kingston and QUBS area up at the top, Lake Ontario, we're getting quite close to the northern range limit, although it does go up a bit further up the St. Lawrence. An important thing to note about this also is that the range is quite extensive and goes over several different types of ecosystems, and the habitat and the environment that they experience here, the northern range limit, can be quite a bit different than they experience more south in the range limit. And so we can't make assumptions about the species as a whole from one particular place in the range. So what I focus my study on is map turtle nest and emergence. This is a picture of 2 hatchlings emerging from the nest. The females, like I said, come on land to lay their eggs. They dig holes in the ground, deposit their eggs in it, and then cover it back up. They do that in May through July. They prefer open areas, probably for the sun to heat the nests. They can search for quite a long time for a perfect site. They are picky about choosing a nice site for laying their eggs. The hatching out of the eggs, so the baby turtles, or the hatchlings as they're called, actually hatch out of the eggs from about 60 to 90 days after they're laid, and they emerge from the nest at some point later, which I'll get into in a moment. And then they head to the water, usually pretty much right away, but can also have been seen to sometimes stay on land. What I find really interesting about these turtles is their dual emergence strategy. Some species of turtles have their hatchlings, the hatchlings of those species emerge from the nest very shortly after they hatch out of the egg, and that's in the same year of laying. Other species have a delayed emergence strategy, or it's called overwintering in the nest, where the hatchlings hatch out of the egg, but they do not emerge from the nest that year. They stay in the nest all winter and then emerge the following spring. So that means that they can be in the nest for a full calendar year. They can be laid in June and not come out till the next June, or close to it. So we know that there are about 43 species of turtles globally that have an overwintering or delayed emergence strategy. And there are some species, including the northern map turtle, that have been shown to do both. They sometimes emerge in the fall, the year they were laid, and they sometimes emerge in the following spring. So that's what I mean by a dual emergence strategy. I just need to give a little shout out here to the group that Steve referred to in my intro, the Friends of Kingston Inner Harbor. It's a volunteer group that has been looking at turtles for 5 or more years. They saw a lot of turtle nests being laid in their neighborhood park and saw that they were being predated at a really high rate. So the nests were being dug up and eaten by raccoons or other animals. So they started protecting them with these nest covers that you see here so that they couldn't be dug up. And they protected dozens, and in some years maybe up to 100 nests a year, all on volunteer power. And they contributed hundreds of observations to Ontario Nature's Reptile and Amphibian Atlas, so documenting the turtles here and making sure that that was in the atlas. However, what we didn't know was how successful nests were, either with or without protection, and we saw hatchlings in both seasons, but didn't really know what was going on there and how often they did one versus the other. When we're talking about research on turtles and what we know and what we don't, there's definitely been a lot of research on turtles globally and locally on things like habitat, diet, and many other things. But there have been far fewer studies on nesting and on hatchling emergence in dual emergence species like the northern map turtles. There were 2 studies done on map turtle nest phenology, and phenology just means the timing of life cycles. And these studies were done in India and Pennsylvania, so a fair bit further south in their range. And so there was no information on the nest phenology for northern map turtles at their northern range limit, or any information about how emergence might differ geographically. Why do we need to address these gaps? Well, there's a reason. For scientific knowledge, understanding species ecology, including adaptation to environment, is one of the main pursuits of biology, and we have a gap in our knowledge here. And more practically, it's very difficult to conserve a species if you don't know parts of its life cycle. How are you going to protect a species if the early part of its life is unknown to you and you don't know when or where it's going to be? Also, with climate change, we know that species are changing both in their range and in their habits, and knowing what they do at the peripheries of their range will help us understand how they might change with climate change. We also know that we have an increasingly urbanized world, and in places where species are persisting in urban areas, they may be especially important to protect if we want to have any species at all. So in order to address some of the gaps that I talked about, I had 2 sort of broad overarching questions. One is what was the rate of survival and the timing of emergence and hatchlings. And then what are the proximate and ultimate factors that might contribute to emergence timing, or what are the local cues and what are the sort of more evolutionary type reasons. So my main study site is in Lesley Park, which is in Kingston. So down in the pink near the bottom of the map is, you can see downtown Kingston. This is the causeway, and the yellow arrow is Lesley Park. So it's on the Cataraqui River at the start of the Rideau Canal, which does go up to Lake Pinnacle and Cubes if you're more familiar with that area, and it connects here with the St. Lawrence and Lake Ontario. This is a picture aerial photograph of the park. It's quite small, but like I said, it's on the river. It has a history of railway and industry factories, and some Indigenous heritage as well. But now it is a manicured park, mostly used for walking and cycling and so on. And part of what makes it a unique site is something that's a bit hard to see in this picture, but there's a line here, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, where these trees are, and that's actually a retaining wall. And this retaining wall provides some protection for the turtles because it keeps them from, when they come up from the water to lay their nests, then they hit this wall and they can't go further, and on the other side of this parking lot is a road, and they can't access the road, so it does sort of protect them from that risk of road mortality. They can get around it at some points, and they sometimes do, but it at least provides partial protection. In this area, I just want to point out there are 4 species of turtles that we know of. So the map turtle, there's the Midland painted turtle, common snapping turtle, and through the few years that I've been doing this study, myself and colleagues have identified that there are eastern musk turtles both living and nesting here as well. Besides the park, I did also include some rural nest sites. And these were in the Cubes area near Katy blocks on Pinnacon and Indian Lakes. These were on the properties of private cottage owners who were kind enough to participate in the study and allow me to put nest boxes on their properties to study the turtles. So thank you very much to those folks. And so I was able to monitor some nests at a little bit different type of location as well. So the general methods that I use to get the information were first to identify nests, which we did by following turtles as they looked for nest sites and then dug their nests, which can be quite a time-consuming process, as they can take hours or even days to do so. And once they're done nesting and kind of left towards the water, we go back to that nest location, carefully excavate it just to get to the top egg without disturbing the egg, so I don't take the eggs out or move them or anything like that. Just put a sensor in, and this is what one of the types of sensors I use looks like. It's actually hard to see, but it is sort of touching a part of an egg that's protruding there. That's a turtle egg. And then I cover that back up with the dirt and put one of those nest covers on to prevent predation. And that nest cover also has the benefit of temporarily trapping hatchlings underneath it, so that I can check those boxes to see when the hatchlings emerge. And then after I record that, I release them at the water. And when all emergence is likely to have finished in July of the year following laying, then I can excavate those nests and see what's inside. So basically, the data that I get is laying date, nest temperature, air temperature, rainfall, the date that they emerge, whether or not the nest was successful, which I defined as having at least one live hatchling emerge, and how many hatchlings there were, if there were more than one, which there usually was, and then the contents at excavation. So it may just be shell fragments, often contained undeveloped eggs, dead hatchlings, or even live hatchlings in a few cases. So what I did with this information, what I was looking for was a few different things. First, was there a relationship between laying date or growing degree days and the time of emergence? So for laying date, were the nests that were laid earlier, did they emerge earlier? Was fall emergence just because the fall emerging nests were ones that were laid earlier in the year or maybe were more developed. Or perhaps on growing degree days, which is a measurement of heat units, which because nests are maybe a little bit different, some might be deeper, some might have more sun or shade, so they might have different amounts of heat, and the hatchlings might develop differently. So we can measure the growing degree days and see if that determines whether hatchlings emerge earlier or later, or fall versus spring. I also looked at their survival and the overwinter temperature. I looked at the predictive capacity of environmental factors, so how likely hatchlings were to emerge given certain temperatures and amount of rainfall. I looked at all those differences between spring and fall emerging clutches as far as environmental factors went. And I looked at the overall patterns of how this fits into delayed emergence geographically. So my general results were that I started out with 61 map turtle nests in the 2018 and 2019 laying seasons, recognizing that 2019 laying season, for example, it goes until 2020. I did have some data loss due to vandalism and malfunctioning sensors, but was still able to get a fair bit. So emergence seasons were September, October in the fall, and then again anywhere from March through June the following year. The overall survival rate of clutches was 70%, but a little bit lower, 65% for those that attempted to overwinter, which means that they did not emerge in the fall, but they did have developed eggs when I excavated them. And these survival rates were lower than those other two map turtle studies that I mentioned. There was a 25% incidence of fall emergence, so 25% of the clutches emerged in the fall, which was quite a bit higher than those other studies. Again, they had 0 to 6% amount of fall emergence. I did find some effects of winter minimum temperature insofar that there was a threshold below about -7 or -8 degrees Celsius. None of those clutches survived if they reached that nest temperature. But above that threshold, there was no effect of minimum nest temperature, meaning that a nest that reached -5 versus a nest that reached -1 had the same likelihood of survival. And there was no relationship to laying date or growing degree days. So earlier nests did not emerge earlier, and there was no relationship to growing degree days, which is what this graph is showing: the fall and spring emerging clutches and the amount of growing degree days that they accumulated, either when they emerged in the fall or for the spring emerging nests, how many growing degree days they had accumulated by fall. So although the average was a little bit lower in the spring, there was not a statistically significant difference. As far as emergence prediction went, there were some interesting results there. The 48-hour cumulative rainfall was a significant predictor of hatchling emergence. So for each millimeter of rainfall, the odds of there being hatchlings present on a given day increased by 2.2. So you can see that in the top graph. It is on a log scale of rainfall, and there you can see again they overlap a lot, almost completely, but the mean of days that the hatchlings were present was quite a bit higher than when they were absent. And the bottom graph is similar. The effect was less, but for the nest air temperature difference, so the difference between the nest temperature and air temperature when hatchlings were present was slightly lower, meaning that they were closer to the same on those days, and that effect was about 0.8 per degree Celsius. Doing logistic regression to combine different variables to predict hatchling presence or absence, it's combining these two that gives the best model to predict hatchling presence. So these two factors working together. Looking at environmental cues by season, basically was a bust. There were no environmental cues, rainfall, temperature, air temperature, nest temperature, combinations of those factors did not provide any significant difference between fall and emerging nests, so, or clutches emerging from their nest. So that leaves us still asking why some might emerge in the fall versus why they might emerge in the spring. So looking at the patterns geographically provides maybe a partial answer to that. So I looked at 7 different studies, and these included both map turtle and painted turtle studies. And painted turtles are another dual emergent species who exist throughout the range as well. So looking at these 7 studies, if you look at the bottom 2 graphs in this panel, the percentage of fall emergence increases with latitude. So the further north we are, the greater the percentage of hatchlings, the percentage of clutches that emerge in the fall versus the spring. And also, conversely, the greater the latitude, the lower the survival. There was, if you look at the top graphs, also a relationship between the winter temperature and fall emergence. So the greater the temperature, the lower the fall emergence. It was not quite a significant relationship in the same way with survival and winter temperature. So a quick summary: rain dates and growing degree days do not determine emergence season. Environmental cues do not determine emergence season. Rainfall and nest air temperature do increase the odds of emergence on a given day, given the 48 hours previous amounts of rainfall and nest air temperature difference. And then fall nest temperature increases with latitude, survival decreases with latitude, which suggests that there may be an adaptation or a limit on an adaptation for fall emergence at higher latitudes because of the lower survival. So because they're less likely to survive through the cold winter, they're more likely to emerge in the fall. Basically, what I gleaned from this research was a better knowledge of the species, their life cycle, and how it might differ geographically. And overall, I hope that this gives me and others some tools for conservation in protecting nests, nesting, and the hatching life stages of the species. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. I hope you're all still awake. And thank you to everybody who helped. There were many, many people that are very supportive. So thank you very much to all those people. And I'm happy to take any questions. I think they're going through the chats if you have any.
Yeah, so if you have any, we're getting a lot of echo and feedback, Lesley. Do you happen to have two devices plugged in at the same time? Yeah, I don't know why. Anyway, if you have questions for Lesley, put them into the chat, or you are also welcome just to pop on and raise your hand, and we can try to have you ask a question that way as well. So Lesley, there are some questions that are popping up in the chat. Do you want me to read them and you can address them?
If you don't mind, that might be easiest.
Yeah. So this is from Peter Hodson. Lesley, given the concern for water, sediment, and food web quality in the Inner Harbor, do you have any sense of whether the abundance of nests, eggs, egg survival, percentage deformities, etc., were different than at other sites where turtles nest?
Well, I didn't look at that specifically, but that is certainly a question that I had. I did not see a high level of mutation. Hatchlings, as far as is visible, at least, seem to be fine. And any that were emerged were mobile and ready to go. As far as the adult turtles go, some of them, a lot of them certainly have injuries, which I highly suspect are from boats, but don't really seem to have deformities. So I didn't look at that specifically. I couldn't say for sure. I didn't have a comparison, but I didn't get a sense that there was a lot of mutation. No.
We have another question here in the chat. Can you tell the sex of the hatchlings?
No, you cannot. My understanding is the only way to do that is, through blood tests. When they're that little, it's hard to tell. You can't really tell until the males become sexually mature around 3 or 4 years. Then you can start to see some differences. Their tails are a bit longer, their heads aren't as big, so on. But until that point, it's very difficult to tell.
So pursuant, I guess, Lesley, to the question that Peter had, with respect to their annual cycle, do you have any notion of where they might overwinter? Do they overwinter in the Inner Harbor, do you think, or do they overwinter somewhere else?
Well, there was a study done through the Friends of Kingston Inner Harbor where they put radio. This is not part of my study, so I cannot take credit for it. But the folks at the Friends did a study where they put radio tags on. I think there were 6 adult female northern map turtles, and saw where they went over winter. And I believe it was 4 of those 6 went to Kingston Mills, so they went up to the first lock station and spent the winter there. And that's probably because the water is a bit deeper or more oxygen rich. But that's partly speculation. But it does seem that some of them do that, and we do see them basking, sort of coming. I don't know if everybody's familiar, but coming sort of further south from that. We see them basking first near where the tannery lands are before they come down to the park. So that seems to be probably where at least some of them are overwintering. Some of them may overwinter in the lake as well, in Lake Ontario, because it is certainly close enough for them to go there.
Okay. We'll make this the last question so we can get to Meg's talk. This is from Vicky Schmolka. Do you have a sense of the overall numbers of northern map turtles in the Inner Harbor and the river itself?
No, so I did undertake a mark recapture study, but didn't end up with quite enough information to get an estimate of population size. What I can tell you is that we know there are at least 139 unique adult females. So there are at least that many adult females we've marked. So by marking them, you can identify the individual, and when you see them again, you know which one. We certainly don't think that we have them all marked, but we know there are a minimum of that many. But that's as far as we sort of got with the mark recapture. We're hoping to do more of that this year and coming years, and maybe get a better idea. But that's where that stands right now.
All right, thank you very much, Lesley. Very much appreciated. So we're going to turn to our next talk, which is by Megan Britt. Megan is also from my lab, also working on herps. She is speaking to us from Orillia, where she's actually undertaken a job with Scales Nature Park, and she's going to be doing some work with herps up there. Meg did her undergraduate at Guelph and Trent. I think you got a degree in forensics at Trent University. One of the things that impressed me when Meg approached me to do a thesis with me is that she had a first authored paper in, I think, biological conservation. Yeah. And it was looking at, and this was part of your undergrad work, I think, but looking at how conservation action really must necessarily involve non-academics to have any great effect. And I was quite impressed with the paper. And Meg came on to start working on one of the systems we've been working on in our lab for about 2 decades now, the spring peeper, and is actually building on the work of another master's student from our lab, Amanda Cecchino, who I see is listening in. So that's very nice. So take it away, Meg.
Thank you, Steve. As Steve mentioned, I'm going to be talking about male advertisement calling tactics in northern and southern populations of spring peeper. So to begin, I would like to discuss mating systems in general. Most mating systems are driven by male competition for opportunities to mate with females. And then females subsequently choose mates based on their attractive traits that indicate male fitness. And all of these advertisement traits can be costly, whether that's energetically or increased predation risk. And therefore, males must apply energy and resources in order to maximize their benefit and probability of obtaining a mate. And allocation towards advertisement may also therefore reduce time and effort that they put towards other necessary behaviors, such as foraging or anti-predatory tactics. And in some species, such as the elephant seal, these traits are associated with territory defense. Peacocks display prominent visual advertisements, which indicate good health and fitness. And across many taxa, advertisement comes in the form of acoustic signals. And most often, I think we think of bird calls. And these acoustic communications can contain specific characteristics like call rate or intensity, and that's what females use to get an idea of that male. So more specifically to anurans, which are frogs and toads, there are also diverse advertisement strategies. Cues can be visual, such as bright color displays or specific motions like the pulsing of a vocal sac or pedal luring, which is when they use their toes to wave at a female. And non-visual cues may be pheromone-based, where males release a mate-attracting chemosignal. And by far the most common tactic in anurans is acoustic signals. So before we can look at mating systems that are based on acoustic signals, we need a basic understanding of the properties of sound. And all sound waves contain the same properties, which are amplitude, wavelength, frequency, time period, and velocity. And it's combinations of these properties that determine how an acoustic sound will be perceived and the way that it will travel through a medium until it becomes degraded. For example, low frequency waves travel further and have less degradation than a high frequency wave. And the easiest way to remember this is if you toss a pebble into a pond, the ripples will be very small and won't travel far, whereas a landslide will create a very large wave that will bypass most obstacles and will travel much further. So the main cause of degradation for an acoustic wave in the atmosphere is the absorption of the energy by the air. And this can depend on temperature and humidity. Hot and humid air has a lower density than cold and dry air, and therefore it allows sound waves to propagate with less resistance and energy absorption. And hot and humid air also tends to rise within the atmosphere. So typically, if a sound is broadcasted from a higher elevation, it will travel better. And the easiest way I find to remember this is that clouds are very high up and they're moisture. And when there's a fire, smoke rises because heat rises. And of course, sound is also affected by physical obstacles. If a sound wave is met with a barrier, some of that energy is absorbed, some of it is refracted in different directions, and some of it is reflected back towards the source of the sound. And all of these variables in conjunction have an effect on acoustic energy, and they're very important to take into account when you are considering a species that relies very heavily on acoustic communication. And as mentioned, one such species is the spring peeper. They are a small North American tree frog that typically is around 2 to 3 centimeters long. They're very well camouflaged and they can range from tan to brown to gray to an olivey green. And they're named for and can be easily identified by the cross marking on their back. But most often they are heard and it's difficult to see them. During the breeding season, which takes place in the spring, male peepers will congregate in wetlands over several nights to call and attract for females that, as I said, will choose males based on their call attributes, which can be affected by the environment. Their mating call is typically characterized as short, repetitive, and tonal. And if you don't know what it sounds like, this is a quick example. So peepers typically inhabit and hunt in brushy undergrowth in forests and grasslands that border wetlands. During the breeding season, the wetlands that peepers congregate in to look for mates include fishless vernal ponds, marshes, swamps, bogs, and both the living and mating habitats can be very diverse. And this is because peepers have a monstrous geographic range in North America. So as you can see on the left, those are the climate classifications of North America. And on the right is the geographic range of the spring peeper. And in species that span several habitats, vocal communication may not vary that much between populations. So in order to make up for that, they can display different behaviors in those populations that will better suit their habitats. If we overlay the peeper habitat on top of the climate classifications, we can see that peepers are broadly distributed across 4 main classifications. And this spans from southern subtropical to northern subarctic ecosystems. And each of these habitats have their own unique challenges. Because the peeper call does not change very much depending on the population, this suggests the opportunity for local adaptation and divergence in the actual behaviors that these populations partake in. So previous research has found that male peepers tend to call from elevated or arboreal perches in southern parts of their range, such as Florida, Georgia, Louisiana. And in the northern part of their range, such as in Ontario, Manitoba, and Quebec, they call exclusively from the ground. And as of yet, we don't really have a good understanding of why this is. So we first looked at why a frog might want to spend the energy to climb somewhere high in order to call in the first place. And as I briefly mentioned, there are benefits to calling from higher up. Arboreal perches can provide better transmission compared to terrestrial calls. It increases the distance that a sound can travel to a female, but calling from arboreal perches can also expose males to windier and drier conditions that can increase evaporative water loss and body temperature changes, and these can negatively impact the characteristics of males' calls. So the benefits of arboreal calling may outweigh the potential costs, which introduces a trade-off. And ultimately, this leads me to my research question, which was, why do southern individuals exhibit arboreal calling while northern individuals are strictly terrestrial? And to answer this question, the first thing we need to think about is what other characteristics vary between these populations. We know their habitats are drastically different. The northern populations experience dramatic environmental differences as the seasons change, whereas in the south, the change between seasons can be much more subtle. Northern habitats also experience much higher variation in temperatures, and that's both from the beginning to the end of breeding season, as well as daytime to nighttime temperatures. And it's similar for humidity. In general, the South is a much warmer and more humid climate. And of course, one of the most noticeable differences lies in the vegetation structure between the habitats. At the northern extremes of the range, populations can experience significant changes in vegetation structure during their breeding season, from relatively open and sparse early in the spring when breeding starts to very dense and closed up by the end of breeding season. In southern populations, vegetation structure remains relatively the same year-round because of a greater number of plants that maintain their leaves. So with consistently dense vegetation, warmer temperatures, and higher humidity levels experienced by southern populations, past selection may have favored perching behavior as a way to bypass transmission obstacles. And my hypothesis lays that vegetation structure and environmental conditions drive the differences in perching behavior between the populations. And my resulting predictions were that the North would experience no benefit of arboreal perching, And if they did experience a benefit, it would likely be later in the season when the conditions are more similar to southern populations. And in the south, I predicted that overall, the peepers would have a higher transmission quality from arboreal perches. So to first test my hypothesis and methods, I conducted a pilot study in 2019. And in this pilot study, I surveyed one randomly chosen transect at 3 wetlands QUBS. And I played a recording of male peepers submitted by Amanda Chiquino. And I broadcasted these along a 10-meter transect, and I re-recorded them at ground level. And at the top, you can see the original 5 peeps of one peeper. And on the bottom left is those same 5 peeps at the beginning of breeding season. And at the bottom right, it's at the end of breeding season. And I think there are roughly 14 harmonics in the original call, 8 of which were perceived at the beginning of breeding season. And by the end of breeding season, there were only 2 or 3 visible harmonics. So the sound was significantly degraded. And keeping this in mind, I moved on to my main study. So my main study focused on 3 wetlands in northern Florida and 3 wetlands in southeastern Ontario during each local breeding season. I chose the wetlands based on whether I observed male choruses there, and I attempted to find wetlands that differed in vegetation structure and classification, but really encompassed the diversity that accurately represented the general habitats in these populations. So at the beginning of each location's peak breeding season, I located 3 calling males in each of my 3 wetlands, and I marked his location and direction, and I created a 2-meter and 8-meter transect. And I used the same recording of 18 males, which includes calls from members of all populations across the species range to eliminate bias. And I broadcasted them from ground level and 1.2 meters up. And this is because 1.2 meters up is roughly the height we observe perching behavior in southern populations. As I said, I record them at ground level because this is where females perceive the calls. And I also tried to estimate the vegetation density along each of the transects. And in order to do this, I took a photograph following each recording at eye level against a 1 meter by 1 meter grid sheet. And for each location, I also measured the air temperature and humidity because they're known to affect acoustics. And I did all of this 4 times over each location's peak breeding season. To summarize my data, I had 3 sites in each Florida and Ontario. Each site had 3 transects, and each transect had 4 treatments, which were ground level, 1.2 meters up for heights, and then for distances, it was 2 and 8 meters. And each recording had 90 individual peeps. And as I said, I did each 4 times over the wetland. And this resulted in roughly 25,000 audio files. The unequal sample sizes is due to an omitted replicate at one of the wetlands at QUBS because of an assistant injury. And in total, I gathered 138 photographs. To quantify the call degradation, I used cross-correlation tests in Raven Pro. And correlation values are calculated by passing the re-recorded call and the original call over each other in time, such that the resulting value will be a number between 0 and 1. And a value of 1 would mean that the calls are exactly the same, and 0 would mean that they're completely different and there's no similarity. And these correlations were performed for each peep and averaged for each transect. To analyze my photographs, I cropped them to include only squares that were not impacted by wind and rolled edges. And I conducted my analysis again in R, and basically what I did was I manipulated each photograph's color thresholds to subset the pixels into black and non-black. And black represents the vegetation, and then anything that is not black is considered the white grid sheet. And this provided a proportion of sheet coverage that will serve as an estimate of vegetation density. And I gathered this by dividing the black pixels by the total pixels. So I first compared my raw cross-correlation values to look for differences in sound degradation between Florida and Ontario. For the sake of this presentation, I'm only going to be discussing the 8-meter transects, but the 2-meter transects did follow similar patterns to the 8-meter transects. As you can see, the sound degradation in Florida remained consistent over time for both arboreal and terrestrial broadcasts, whereas in Ontario, the sound quality decreased dramatically from the beginning of the end to the breeding season, regardless of whether it was arboreal or terrestrial. However, what's difficult to discern from these plots is whether there was a benefit of arboreal or terrestrial broadcasts for either population. So to better determine if either population benefited from arboreal calling, I created what I call the degradation metric. And for this, I subtracted the correlation value for each transect at ground level from the correlation value from the arboreal treatment. And this allowed me to have one value that compared the height treatments instead of two. The resulting values of the degradation metric, as I said, indicate whether arboreal or terrestrial is more beneficial. Basically, if the values are above 0, this means that arboreal was better. If the values are below 0, then terrestrial was better. And if they are at 0, there was no benefit or detriment either way. What we can gather from this plot is that Florida's metrics are generally above 0, which means that arboreal was more beneficial. Whereas in Ontario, we have some that are below, some are above, but mostly they're around 0. So they do not seem to have the same benefit of arboreal calling as southern populations do. And this is perhaps to be expected as these results mirror the calling behaviors that we observe in these populations. So then I tried to determine why this occurs. The results of my vegetation density analysis indicated that the variation between the two focus regions was significant. This was in line with my prediction that Florida's vegetation would not change very much. It's relatively consistent. And Ontario's, we observed a dramatic increase throughout the season, and it actually more than doubled, more than tripled, depending on the way you look at it. Similarly, the air temperature and relative humidity in Florida remained consistent, apart from a very uncharacteristic cold snap that occurred during my last sampling time. And Ontario's environmental characteristics were much more variable, with the air temperature in Ontario more than doubling from the beginning to the end of the breeding season, and humidity following a similar pattern. When I looked at the possible explanatory variables, I found that air temperature was a significant predictor of mating call degradation in Ontario. I also found that air temperature, humidity, and vegetation were all extremely correlated. And even though air temperature was the variable that was significant, it could potentially be a combination of all three of these variables, but I simply didn't have the statistical power to disentangle them. And this was because for this analysis, I had to average the call degradation and vegetation density to the level of the wetland as opposed to the level of the transects. And this was because I had 3 transects within each wetland, but they all had the same air temperature and humidity. So I only ended up with 12 data points for Florida and 11 for Ontario, given that one omitted replicate. However, these results do suggest that it was environmental characteristics that underlie the differences between Ontario and Floridian populations, and why Ontario doesn't seem to benefit from arboreal calling. In summary, I observed that the acoustics of spring peeper mating calls behave differently in Florida and Ontario. Populations from the south seem to benefit from arboreal call propagation, and populations in northern habitats seem to better fare calling from terrestrial or don't seem to have a benefit at all from arboreal calling. This means that the individuals in these populations are behaving in the manner that is most beneficial for them when looking for a mate. And my results do suggest that this is likely due to a combination of environmental differences between habitats, although air temperature was the most statistically significant. And finally, all of this is important because divergence in mating systems can often be one of the first signs of divergence between populations and could potentially lead to the formations of new species. So it's really interesting to keep tabs on that sort of thing. So I would like to thank everyone who encouraged me throughout this project, the Austin Lab at UF, and of course the Lockheed Lab. And thank you for all listening to my presentation. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Meg. Once again, if you have questions for Meg, just pop them into the chat, please, and I'll read them in my stentorian tones, and I'm sure Meg would be happy to answer them.
Hi, Steve. I have a question, and I'm a really crappy typist, so I'll just say it out loud if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
So Meg, thanks for the talk. Really interesting. I was wondering, one of the downsides of arboreal calling is that the females are trying to find a signal in a three-dimensional matrix, as opposed to a two-dimensional with terrestrial calling. And I wondered how that would maybe erode the benefits of the arboreal calling that the males show in the south.
So yeah, we aren't really sure how the females approach the males who are calling arboreally, if they do jump down when they spot the female, or if I don't believe the females climb up. The way I believe it works is that because the vegetation is so consistently dense in Florida, if you broadcast it from high up, it can bypass transmission obstacles and then refract down and disperse through the different levels of vegetation. Whereas in the north, specifically at the beginning of breeding season, there's no vegetation to even go through. So it can just travel straight. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. So what you're saying is that the females don't climb up to meet the male. It's likely that the male, so the females basically are traveling in two dimensions and the male hops down to intercept.
I believe that's what happens. Yeah, males in the south do call terrestrially occasionally. There are a few populations that are 100% arboreal, but what I believe is that if there's vegetation like this and they're calling from the ground, it's just going to likely stop at the vegetation. Whereas if they're calling from up high, it can bypass and travel downward towards the females.
Great, thanks very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever found a female up in a tree. I mean, a female peeper.
Ha ha.
Aha. Anyone else?
I have a question, Meg. So it was a great talk, super interesting stuff. I'm wondering, is it possible that the difference in behavior that we see during the mating season is just a byproduct of difference in behavior outside of the breeding season, so that northern population, for whatever reasons, tend to stick to the ground more outside of the breeding season than southern populations, or more arboreal for their own reasons?
That's possible. I don't know much about their behavior outside of breeding season, to be honest, because I was just so focused on those few months. I'm not sure if I've ever seen a peeper, even in off season, climbing up in the north. So it is very possible that they always remain terrestrial even when it's not breeding season. So yeah, that would be very interesting to look at.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
So we have a question here in the chat. It says Shirley French, but I think it's Tony Noble. I'm not sure. One of those two. How do you take wind effects into consideration? Wind presumably greatly dissipates the sound energy.
Yeah, so I did also measure wind. I didn't include it in this study just because in my initial statistical analyses, I did test if wind had any significant impact, and it didn't seem to. And I'm wondering if that's because the wetlands that I surveyed mostly were surrounded by forests in the first place. I think the maximum was probably 1 meter per second. So any differences that I saw were pretty negligible. I'm sure it would be different if, it was quite a lot heavier, but in my study areas, I didn't experience that.
So do we know anything about behavioral flexibility, Meg? In other words, are there some individuals, because in southern populations, you sometimes will find some individuals on the ground and some up in trees. And do we know whether those individuals on the ground just sort of hang out on the ground typically, or whether there's sort of polymorphism or variability within a population? Some individuals have a propensity to climb, some individuals stay on the ground.
In my experience, when I went down to Florida, there was a couple of times where the chorus wasn't very strong. It was only 5 to 10 males. So I would approach the same male more than once. And the first time it might have been on the ground, and then I might have spooked it or something. And then I saw it again on top of shrubbery. So I did see individuals displaying both behaviors during one night.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I have
Do
a
we
question.
have one final question?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a risky strategy to me to be arboreal. You're getting the broadcast advantage, but at the same time, are they not fertilizing in the pond, in the water? And doesn't that make males susceptible to sneak strategies from other males that might just sort of ambush the female when they come to that shrubbery?
Yes, satellite males are always a risk, but that's true whether the caller is terrestrial or arboreal. I don't know of any sort of bias or if satellite or sneaker males have a better chance of intercepting an arboreal caller as opposed to a terrestrial caller. But truth be told, there's not a lot known about how arboreal callers and females link up. I'm just really not sure. As I said, I assume the male hops down, but I can't be positive of that.
Yeah, I was wondering about if the female signals to him, she peeps to him back, and if that's how they.
Females do not do mating calls. It's only the males.
Interesting.
The only thing I've seen, Adam, is on a couple of occasions I've seen males do a dive. So, in other words, not in reaction to me, but actually drop into the water. And I think
they're pretty speedy when they hop down.
So when the female, I don't know how they sense the females, but when they do, they just drop right into the water. So at least the two I've seen. So not really a generalizable.
I was trying to get a knights who say knee voice going there for shrubbery.
Yeah, no, I caught the illusion. I wanted you to lead. Peter's just asking, why don't we make this the final question for you, Meg? I know you'll want to get. I don't even know where you are. Are you in the woods? That nice black background?
No, I'm in the education studio.
Oh, wow. So Peter asked, what is the mortality rate due to avian predators? Because that's obviously a cost of perching.
I have no idea. I don't know much about birds at all. From my limited knowledge, birds typically hunt during the day. Correct me if I'm wrong, but males call at night. They generally don't call during the day at all. So I don't think there's a huge risk of avian predators.
Well, there are a few nocturnal avian predators, but I think the higher predator risk is snakes, and there are arboreal snakes down in the south. So
yeah, they are very hard to spot. Like I said, they're very well camouflaged. It takes a while for me to find them. So
yeah, although I've seen snakes, a lot of snakes eating a lot of frogs. So anyway, I think we better let you, Meg, off the hook. And I wish to thank both Lesley and Megan for giving wonderful talks. And I would also like to thank all of you for taking time this evening to attend our inaugural QUBS seminar. So thank you very much all.